He thought he could humiliate me in front of everyone who mattered. Standing there in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, champagne glass raised high, announcing to our closest friends and business associates that our 15-year marriage was over. What he didn't expect was my attorney walking through those ballroom doors at the exact moment his words left his lips, carrying documents that would change everything. The look on David's face when he realized I'd been 3 steps ahead, all along, priceless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and until 3 months ago, I believed I was living the perfect life. Married to my college sweetheart, co-owner of a thriving marketing consultancy in Portland, living in a stunning Pearl District home with floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the city skyline. From the outside, David and I were the golden couple. Successful, attractive, seemingly inseparable after 15 years of marriage and 10 years of building Mitchell & Associates from nothing into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. I should have known something was wrong when David started suggesting I work from home more often. It began subtly, almost considerately. "You've been putting in such long hours lately, honey. Why don't you take some meetings from the house tomorrow? You could use the break." At first, I appreciated his concern. After all, we'd both been grinding nonstop to secure 3 major tech startup accounts that would set us up for the next 5 years. But as weeks passed, the suggestions became more pointed. David would volunteer to handle client presentations I'd spent weeks preparing for. He'd reschedule meetings I'd arranged, claiming conflicts with his calendar that somehow never materialized. When I questioned these changes, he'd flash that charming smile that had won me over in college and say something like, "I'm just trying to take some pressure off you, Sarah. We're a team, remember?" Team. That word started to taste bitter in my mouth as I watched David gradually position himself as the face of our company while I became increasingly invisible. It wasn't dramatic or sudden enough to call out directly. Instead, it was like watching someone slowly turn down the volume on your voice until you realized you were barely audible in your own life. The first real warning sign came during our quarterly review meeting with Margaret Foster, our most important client and the CEO of a rapidly growing software company. I'd developed their entire rebranding strategy, conducted months of market research, and crafted what I knew was brilliant campaign messaging. As we sat in Margaret's downtown office, David presented my work as if it had emerged fully formed from his own mind. "The key insight I had," he said, clicking through slides I'd created at 3 a.m, was understanding that their target demographic responds better to authentic storytelling than traditional tech marketing. I sat there, watching him claim credit for discoveries I'd made through countless hours of consumer interviews and data analysis. When Margaret asked a detailed question about the research methodology, David glanced at me briefly before smoothly deflecting. "Sarah handled some of the background legwork on that. The important thing is the strategic direction we're taking." Background legwork, strategic direction we're taking. Each phrase was a small knife, precisely placed. After the meeting, as we walked to our car, I couldn't stay silent anymore. "David, that presentation was based entirely on my research. My interviews, my analysis, my strategic recommendations. Why didn't you mention that?" He stopped walking and turned to face me, his expression shifting to that patient, slightly condescending look I'd been seeing more frequently. "Sarah, we're partners. Your work, my work, it's all our work. Margaret doesn't need to know who did what behind the scenes. She cares about results, and we delivered them." "But it matters to me," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "I spent 3 months developing that strategy. I deserve credit for my own ideas." David sighed, the sound carrying just enough frustration to make me feel like I was being unreasonable. "You're being too sensitive about this. We both contributed to the success. Isn't that what marriage is about? Supporting each other? That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, trying to pinpoint when supporting each other had become code for erasing my contributions. When had my husband started treating me like a junior employee in the company we'd built together? The pattern accelerated over the following weeks. David began scheduling important client calls during times when I had other commitments. He'd apologize profusely afterward, explaining that the clients had insisted on those specific times. But somehow, these conflicts always seemed to involve our most prestigious accounts. When I suggested rescheduling my commitments to join the calls, he'd wave me off. "Don't worry about it. I can handle this one solo. You focus on the Henderson project." The Henderson project was our smallest account, a local restaurant group that paid us a fraction of what our tech clients did. Important work, but hardly the kind of high-profile engagement that builds industry reputation. I began to see the careful architecture of what David was constructing. He was systematically removing me from the spotlight while positioning himself as the visionary leader of our company. My suspicions crystallized during an industry conference in Seattle, where we'd both been invited to speak on a panel about marketing innovation. 2 weeks before the event, David called me into his office with an apologetic expression. "I have some bad news about the Seattle conference. They had to restructure the panel format, and they're only taking one speaker from each company now." I felt my stomach drop. Which one of us are they keeping? Well, since I've been handling most of the major client relationships lately, they thought it would make sense for me to represent Mitchell and Associates. His tone was reasonable, almost regretful, but I caught something else underneath. Satisfaction? Maybe. Or relief. "David, we were both invited specifically because of our different expertise areas. I was supposed to speak about consumer psychology research, and you were covering digital strategy implementation. How can one person represent both topics effectively?" He shrugged, a gesture that seemed almost practiced. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'll incorporate your key points into my presentation. Don't worry, I'll make sure to mention your contributions. Mention my contributions, like footnotes in my own career. That weekend, while David was playing golf with potential clients, I did something I'd never done before. I called the conference organizers directly. The conversation lasted exactly 3 minutes and confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm confused," said the program coordinator. "We never changed the panel format. We've been expecting both you and your husband. In fact, we were concerned when your husband called last week to say you wouldn't be able to attend due to a family emergency. Is everything all right?" "Family emergency." I thanked her, confirmed my attendance, and hung up with hands that weren't quite steady. David had lied to me directly, manufactured a story to exclude me from a professional opportunity, and done it so smoothly that I'd almost believed his version of events. The realization hit me like cold water. This wasn't about partnership or supporting each other. This was systematic erasure, carefully planned and methodically executed. My husband was stealing my professional identity, one presentation at a time. That evening, when David returned from golf, I confronted him about the conference call. His reaction told me everything I needed to know. For just a moment, his carefully constructed facade slipped, and I saw something calculating behind his eyes before the charm clicked back into place. "Oh, that's fantastic news that they reversed their decision," he said, his voice a little too bright. "I must have misunderstood what they told me initially. You know how these event planners can be always changing their minds at the last minute?" Even his lies had become lazy, as if he no longer respected me enough to craft convincing deceptions. I nodded and smiled, but something fundamental had shifted inside me. The woman who would have accepted his explanation, who would have chosen to believe in misunderstandings rather than malicious intent, was gone. From that moment forward, I began paying attention differently. I started documenting things, not because I planned to use the information, but because I needed to understand the scope of what was happening to my life. I created a private folder on my personal laptop and began taking screenshots of emails, saving copies of proposals, recording the details of conversations that seemed designed to diminish my role. What I discovered was breathtaking in its thoroughness. David hadn't just been marginalizing me recently. This had been going on for over a year, so gradually that I'd adapted to each small change without recognizing the larger pattern. Client introductions where I was presented as David's wife who helps out with the business. Email chains where my ideas were presented without attribution. Meeting invitations that somehow failed to reach my inbox until after decisions had been made. The most devastating discovery came when I accessed our shared business files and found a folder labeled Strategic Planning, Confidential. Inside were documents outlining David's 5-year vision for Mitchell and Associates. According to his projections, the company would transition to a single-owner model, with him as the sole principal and me moving into a supportive administrative role. There were even draft job descriptions for my new position: marketing assistant, reporting to David Mitchell, CEO. I sat in my home office, staring at my laptop screen, feeling something cold and sharp crystallizing in my chest. This wasn't a marriage dissolving naturally or a business partnership that had run its course. This was theft. David was systematically stealing the company I'd built, the reputation I'd earned, the professional identity I'd spent 15 years creating. But why? We were successful together. Our combined skills had made Mitchell and Associates more profitable than either of us could have achieved alone. What could he possibly gain by pushing me out? The answer came 3 days later in the most cliché way possible. I'd forgotten my presentation folder at the office and returned after dinner to retrieve it. The building was mostly empty, just a few lights scattered across the floors of the high-rise that housed our suite. I used my key card to enter our office space, walking quietly down the hallway toward my office. That's when I heard David's laugh coming from the conference room. Not his public laugh, the one he used with clients and at networking events, but his genuine laugh, the one I remembered from our early dating days, when he found something truly amusing. I hadn't heard that laugh directed at anything I'd said in months. I approached the conference room quietly, not out of suspicion but simple curiosity about what could be keeping him at the office so late. Through the partially open door, I saw David sitting across from Amanda Torres, our newest account manager. She was a striking woman in her early 30s, ambitious and confident, with the kind of polished appearance that screamed future executive. They weren't reviewing client files or discussing strategy. David was leaning forward, his hand covering hers on the conference table, their voices low and intimate. As I watched, Amanda smiled and moved closer to him, her fingers tracing along his wrist in a gesture that was unmistakably romantic. "When are you going to tell her?" Amanda asked, her voice soft but clearly audible in the quiet office. David's response made my blood freeze. "Soon, after the anniversary party next month. I'll make the announcement then, in front of everyone. Clean break, public declaration. Sarah won't be able to drag it out or make it messy if there are witnesses." "And the business?" "Already handled. The paperwork has been in motion for weeks. By the time she realizes what's happening, I'll have controlling interest, and she'll be lucky to walk away with a settlement. Mitchell and Associates will continue, just with better leadership." Amanda laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Before we begin," he said, settling into the chair across from me, "I want you to know that anything you share with me today is completely confidential, regardless of whether you decide to retain my services." I nodded, appreciating his professionalism. "Elena told you about potential partnership issues?" She mentioned observing concerning patterns in how business decisions were being made at Mitchell and Associates. Credit attribution, client relationship management. strategic planning processes that seem to exclude one of the founding partners. Robert's voice remained neutral, but his eyes were sharp with intelligence. She was particularly troubled by conversations she overheard about restructuring the company without your knowledge or consent. The relief of having someone understand the situation without extensive explanation was overwhelming. How much did she tell you about my specific circumstances? Enough to know that you're dealing with systematic marginalization, possible asset manipulation, and what appears to be coordinated efforts to diminish your role in a company you helped build. Robert opened his portfolio and withdrew a legal pad. What I need to understand is the full scope of what you're facing and what outcomes you're hoping to achieve. For the next hour, I laid out everything I'd discovered. David's gradual exclusion of me from major decisions, the lies about conference invitations and client meetings, the secret strategic planning documents that positioned me as a future employee rather than partner. I told him about discovering the affair and overhearing David's plan to announce our separation at the anniversary party while simultaneously seizing control of our business. Robert took notes steadily, occasionally asking clarifying questions about timeline, documentation, and legal structures. His expression never changed, but I noticed him paying particular attention when I mentioned the loan I'd guaranteed and the digital assets tied to my personal financial backing. Your husband has been more clever than most people attempting this kind of maneuver, Robert said when I finished, but he's made several critical errors that work in your favor. Such as? First, he's assumed you're passive and won't fight back, which has made him careless about covering his tracks. Second, he's focused so intently on the public relations aspect of the separation that he's neglected some important legal vulnerabilities. Third, and most significantly, he's attempted this scheme while you still have equal legal standing and access to business records. Robert flipped to a fresh page in his notepad. Here's what I'm seeing from a legal perspective. Your partnership agreement includes provisions for dissolution, but it also includes clauses protecting both partners from asset manipulation during personal disputes. Your husband's systematic exclusion of you from business decisions could constitute breach of fiduciary duty. The loan you guaranteed creates additional legal protections for your interests. And if we can document that he's been planning to defraud you of your rightful share of the business, we have grounds for various legal remedies. What kind of remedies? Depends on how aggressive you want to be and what outcome you're seeking. Do you want to preserve the partnership and your marriage, or are you prepared to dissolve both on terms that protect your interests? I thought about David humming in the shower that morning, planning his public humiliation of me while pretending to be a loving husband. I want justice. I want him to understand that actions have consequences, and I want to walk away from this with everything I've rightfully earned. Robert nodded slowly. Then we need to move quickly and strategically. If your husband is planning to make his announcement at your anniversary party, we need to be prepared with our own surprises. How much time do we have? 4.5 weeks. Enough time to build a solid case, but we'll need to work efficiently. Robert closed his portfolio and leaned forward slightly. Sarah, I want to be completely honest with you about what this process entails. If we proceed, you'll be declaring war on your husband and his allies. It will be emotionally difficult, legally complex, and potentially expensive. Are you prepared for that level of conflict? I thought about Elena, who'd cared enough to reach out despite no longer working for us. About Margaret Foster, who'd specifically asked for my input during meetings even when David tried to sideline me. About the years I'd spent building Mitchell and Associates, the clients who trusted my expertise, the reputation I'd earned through genuine skill and dedication. I'm prepared, I said firmly. What do we need to do? Robert outlined a strategy that was both comprehensive and ruthless. First, we'd conduct a complete audit of all business assets, using my legitimate access to gather documentation before David could restrict it. Second, we'd investigate the extent of his relationship with Amanda and determine whether company resources had been used inappropriately for personal purposes. Third, we'd prepare a legal framework for protecting my interests during the dissolution process. Most importantly, we'd prepare for the anniversary party itself. If David wanted to make a public spectacle of ending our marriage, we'd be ready, with our own presentation. The documents Robert would prepare wouldn't just protect my financial interests, they'd demonstrate that I'd been several steps ahead of David's schemes all along. One crucial element, Robert added as we prepared, to leave. We need to document everything going forward. Every conversation, every email, every business decision. If your husband realizes you're preparing for legal action, he may accelerate his timeline or take steps to hide assets. We need evidence of his behavior and planning in real time. I left the coffee shop feeling energized for the first time in months. The victim mentality that had been dragging me down was replaced by something sharper and more purposeful. David thought he was orchestrating my downfall, but he'd actually created the perfect conditions for his own undoing. That evening, I returned home to find David in his study, working late as had become his habit. I knocked on the door frame to announce my presence, playing the role of considerate wife he expected. "How was your day?" I asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Busy," he replied without looking up from his laptop. "The Peterson account is demanding major revisions to their campaign strategy. Might need to work through the weekend to get it sorted." The Peterson account was one I'd managed exclusively for 2 years. David had never been directly involved with their strategy development, which meant he was either lying about working on it or planning to take credit for work I'd already completed. Either way, it was useful information for my documentation process. "Do you need help with the Peterson materials?" I offered. "I have extensive notes on their brand preferences and target demographic analysis." David finally looked up, his expression carrying that familiar hint of condescension. "Thanks, but I've got it handled." Sometimes a fresh perspective is exactly what a stagnant campaign needs. Stagnant campaign. The Peterson account had increased their marketing budget by 40% based on the success of strategies I'd developed. Fresh perspective from someone who'd never worked directly with the client. The arrogance was breathtaking. "Of course," I said mildly. "Let me know if you change your mind." As I left his study, I made mental notes of everything he'd said. Robert had emphasized the importance of documenting David's systematic dismissal of my contributions, and this conversation was a perfect example. David wasn't just stealing my work, he was actively disparaging it to justify his theft. Over the following days, I began implementing the strategy Robert and I had developed. During normal business hours, I maintained my usual professional routine, while quietly gathering comprehensive documentation of our business operations, financial records, client communications, project histories, employee evaluations, strategic planning documents, everything that would demonstrate my integral role in building and managing Mitchell & Associates. The process was illuminating in ways I hadn't expected. Reviewing 5 years of business records made clear just how much of our success had been built on my relationships, my strategic insights, and my project management skills. David was an excellent salesman and public speaker, but the substance behind our reputation came largely from work I'd initiated and executed. I also began paying closer attention to David's behavior patterns, documenting the lies and misdirections that had become his normal operating procedure. The fake meetings that justified long absences, the client calls that supposedly required his exclusive attention, the strategic decisions he claimed to be making independently that were actually based on research and recommendations I'd provided weeks earlier. Most revealing was his increasing carelessness about covering his tracks. David had become so confident in my supposed obliviousness that he barely bothered to maintain consistent stories about his activities. He'd mention having dinner with potential clients on evenings when I later discovered he'd been with Amanda. He'd claimed to be researching new market opportunities while actually planning the dissolution of our partnership. The deeper I dug into our business records, the more evidence I found of David's systematic efforts to marginalize me. Email threads where my contributions were edited out before being shared with clients, meeting notes that attributed my ideas to David or presented them as collaborative insights rather than my individual work. Financial projections that gradually reduced my role in future business development. Most damaging was a series of conversations David had been having with our accountant, Jennifer Kim, about restructuring our business entity. According to the email records I found, David had been exploring options for converting our partnership into a sole proprietorship with me as a salaried employee. He'd even requested projections for my potential salary, which was less than half of what I currently earned as an equal partner. The documentation process was emotionally exhausting, but it was also empowering. Every piece of evidence I gathered strengthened my legal position and clarified the scope of David's betrayal. This wasn't a marriage that had naturally run its course or a business partnership that needed restructuring. This was systematic fraud, executed by someone who'd assumed I was too trusting and passive to fight back. 2 weeks into my investigation, I made a discovery that changed everything. While reviewing our company's financial records, I noticed a pattern of unusual expense reports submitted by Amanda over the past 6 months. Business dinners with clients I'd never heard of, travel expenses for conferences that didn't appear on our marketing calendar, consulting fees for services that weren't reflected in any client work I could identify. Cross-referencing Amanda's expense reports with David's calendar and travel records revealed the scope of what they'd been doing. The business dinners were personal dates charged to our company. The travel expenses were for romantic getaways disguised as professional development. The consulting fees were payments to Amanda for work she was already being paid to do as our employee. They'd been using Mitchell & Associates as their personal expense account, funding their affair with money that belonged equally to me. The financial impact was significant, but the legal implications were even more important. David and Amanda had committed fraud against our business partnership, creating grounds for both civil litigation and potential criminal charges. I photographed every relevant document and forwarded copies to the secure folder Robert and I had, established for evidence storage. This wasn't just about divorce and business dissolution anymore. David had opened himself to serious legal consequences through his greed and carelessness. That weekend, while David claimed to be at a client retreat that I now knew was actually a romantic getaway with Amanda, I met with Robert again to review our growing collection of evidence. His reaction to the financial documentation was immediate and professional, but I caught a glimpse of satisfaction in his expression. "This changes our entire strategic position," he said, spreading the expense reports across the table. "Your husband hasn't just planned to defraud you of your business partnership. He's actually been committing fraud against the partnership for months, using company funds for personal expenses related to his extramarital affair." What does that mean practically? It means we can seek immediate injunctive relief to prevent further asset dissipation. It means we can demand full financial forensic auditing of all business accounts. Most importantly, it means your husband has created criminal liability for himself and his accomplice. Robert opened his laptop and began drafting preliminary legal documents while we spoke. "Sarah, I need you to understand something important. What we've discovered gives us tremendous leverage, but it also escalates the stakes considerably. When we confront your husband with this evidence, we'll be threatening not just his financial interests, but his personal freedom and professional reputation." "Good," I said firmly. "He's been systematically destroying my professional reputation while stealing from our joint business. He deserves whatever consequences result from his own choices." "I agree, but I want you to be prepared for how he might react. People facing serious legal consequences can become desperate and unpredictable. We'll need to take precautions to protect both your personal safety and your legal interests." Robert outlined additional security measures we'd need to implement. changing locks and security codes at both our home and office, restricting David's access to joint bank accounts and business credit lines, preparing for the possibility that he might attempt to destroy evidence or transfer assets once he realized the scope of our investigation. "When do we confront him?" I asked. "At the anniversary party, exactly as planned, but not the way he's expecting." Robert's expression was coolly professional, but there was something predatory in his eyes. "Instead of you being surprised by his announcement, he'll be surprised by ours. We'll have comprehensive documentation of his fraud, legal papers restricting his access to business assets, and a public audience to witness his reaction." The anticipation was intoxicating. Poor Sarah. She really has no idea, does she? None whatsoever. She still thinks we're the perfect couple planning our 15th anniversary celebration. It's almost sad how trusting she is. I backed away from the door slowly, my heart pounding. So hard I was afraid they might hear it. I made it to the elevator and down to the parking garage without making a sound. But once I was safely in my car, I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. David wasn't just having an affair. He was planning to humiliate me publicly at our anniversary party, in front of our friends, family, and business associates. He intended to announce our separation at what everyone expected to be a celebration of our marriage, ensuring maximum shock and embarrassment. Meanwhile, he'd been quietly maneuvering to steal our company out from under me, probably with Amanda positioned to take my place both personally and professionally. The cruelty of it was stunning. Not just the betrayal, but the calculated nature of the timing. Our anniversary party was going to be his stage for destroying my life, and he was looking forward to it. I drove home in a strange state of clarity. The hurt would come later, I knew, but right now I felt something else entirely. David thought I was trusting to the point of stupidity. He believed I'd be caught completely off guard by his announcement, that I'd crumble publicly while he emerged as the strong, decisive one who'd outgrown his naive wife. He was wrong about me. Catastrophically wrong. That night, I lay in bed next to my husband, listening to him sleep peacefully while I stared at the ceiling and began to plan. David wanted to make a public spectacle of ending our marriage. He wanted to steal my company while I stood there helpless and humiliated. He could certainly try. But if he thought Sarah Mitchell was going to be a passive victim in his carefully orchestrated betrayal, he was about to learn exactly how wrong he could be. I had 5 weeks until our anniversary party. 5 weeks to prepare for the performance of my lifetime. 5 weeks to ensure that when David made his announcement, I'd be ready with a few surprises of my own. The game was about to begin, and this time, I intended to win. The next morning, I woke up with the kind of mental clarity that comes from finally understanding the rules of a game you've been losing without realizing you were playing. David was already in the shower, humming some tune I didn't recognize, probably something Amanda had introduced him to. I lay there listening to his contentment, marveling at how someone could sleep so peacefully while orchestrating such elaborate deception. Over breakfast, I watched my husband with new eyes. The way he checked his phone constantly, smiling at messages he didn't share. How he'd developed sudden enthusiasm for working late and weekend meetings that never appeared on our shared calendar. The expensive cologne that had replaced his usual scent, chosen for someone else's preferences. All the classic signs I'd been unconsciously ignoring because I trusted the man I'd married 15 years ago. That version of David might have deserved my trust. This stranger wearing his face certainly didn't. I spent the morning at my home, office, but instead of working on client projects, I began what I privately called my investigation phase. If David thought he could manipulate me through ignorance, I'd cure myself of that disadvantage immediately. I started with our business partnership agreement, a document I helped draft when we formalized Mitchell & Associates 7 years ago. Reading through the legal language with fresh perspective, I realized how naive we'd both been about protecting our individual interests. The partnership was structured as an equal split, but there were loopholes David could exploit if he planned. Carefully enough. Provisions for dissolution, asset distribution, and decision-making authority that seemed fair when we drafted them, but could be weaponized against a partner who wasn't paying attention. I made copies of everything and stored them in a secure cloud folder David couldn't access. Financial records, client contracts, intellectual property documentation, employee agreements. If David was planning a corporate takeover disguised as a divorce, I needed to understand exactly what assets were at stake and how vulnerable I really was. The picture that emerged was troubling but not hopeless. Our business was worth approximately $4 million, built on client relationships, proprietary processes, and reputation. David had been carefully positioning himself as the primary face of the company, but I'd been documenting my contributions meticulously for years as part of our standard business practices: emails, project files, client testimonials, financial records of accounts I'd personally secured and managed. More importantly, I discovered something David had probably forgotten about. When we'd expanded into digital marketing 3 years ago, I'd personally guaranteed a significant loan using my pre-marriage trust fund as collateral. That meant I had legal claim to a substantial portion of our digital assets, software licenses, and proprietary algorithms. David might be able to steal credit for my work, but he couldn't steal my legal ownership of the tools that made that work possible. My phone rang while I was deep in financial documentation. The caller ID showed Robert Chen, an attorney I'd met at several networking events over the years. We'd never worked together professionally, but I'd always been impressed by his reputation for handling complex business disputes with surgical precision. "Sarah, I hope you don't mind me calling directly," Robert said without preamble. "Elena Rodriguez mentioned you might be dealing with some partnership complications." Elena was my former assistant, who'd left Mitchell & Associates 6 months ago to work for a nonprofit. I'd maintained our friendship despite David's subtle discouragement, and apparently, that loyalty was about to pay dividends I hadn't expected. "Elena mentioned my situation?" I asked carefully. "She was concerned about some conversations she'd overheard before leaving your company. Discussions about restructuring that didn't seem to include your input. She thought you might benefit from some confidential legal advice." I felt a surge of gratitude toward Elena, who'd obviously seen more than she'd let on during her final weeks at the company. "I might indeed need some guidance. Could we meet somewhere private?" "How about this afternoon? There's a quiet coffee shop in Hawthorne, Grounded Coffee. I can be there at 3 if that works for you." After hanging up, I sat staring at my phone, realizing that my isolation hadn't been as complete as I'd thought. Elena had seen David's maneuvering and cared enough to reach out through professional channels. Maybe other people had noticed the systematic marginalization I'd been experiencing. Maybe I had more allies than David realized. I arrived at Grounded Coffee 15 minutes early, choosing a corner table where we could speak privately. The space was perfect for confidential conversations, filled with the ambient noise of espresso machines and quiet conversations that would mask our discussion. Robert arrived precisely at 3, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the kind of neutral expression that probably served him well in high-stakes negotiations. David has scheduled a meeting with me for Thursday afternoon to finalize some of the restructuring paperwork. He's expecting me to have the documents ready for execution, including transfer of asset ownership and modification of banking authorities. The timeline was accelerating faster than I'd anticipated. David wasn't waiting until after the anniversary party to begin his corporate takeover. He was planning to complete the legal theft of my business before announcing our separation, ensuring I'd have no recourse once his betrayal became public. "Can you delay that meeting without arousing suspicion?" I asked. "I can claim I need additional documentation or legal review. That might buy us a few days, maybe a week at most. That should be sufficient. In the meantime, I need you to secure all original financial documents and ensure David can't access or modify any business accounts without proper authorization from both partners." Jennifer nodded, clearly relieved to be taking action against what she'd recognized as financial impropriety. I'll implement additional security protocols immediately. Any changes to banking authorities or asset transfers will require written approval from both partners, properly notarized and legally documented. After Jennifer left, I immediately called Robert Chen to update him on these developments. His reaction was swift and decisive. "Your husband has accelerated his timeline, which means we need to accelerate ours," Robert said. "If he's attempting to execute financial restructuring this week, we need to seek immediate legal intervention to prevent asset manipulation." "What can we do?" "I'm filing for emergency injunctive relief this afternoon. We'll request immediate court orders preventing any changes to business ownership structure, asset transfers, or banking authorities without proper legal review. The evidence Jennifer provided gives us clear grounds for demonstrating attempted fraud." Robert's efficiency was reassuring, but the escalation also meant increased risk. "Won't David realize we're taking legal action once the court orders are served?" "Possibly, but at this point, protecting your assets takes priority over maintaining the element of surprise. We can't allow him to complete the theft of your business while we're preparing for the anniversary party confrontation." That afternoon, I drove to Robert's office to review and sign the legal documents he'd prepared. His law firm occupied 2 floors of a downtown high-rise, with conference rooms that radiated professional competence and financial success. The paralegal who escorted me to Robert's office was clearly accustomed to handling sensitive, high-stakes legal matters. Robert had prepared a comprehensive package of legal filings that addressed every aspect of David's attempted fraud. Injunctive, relief to prevent asset manipulation. Forensic accounting requests to trace all suspicious financial transactions. Restraining orders to prevent destruction of business records. Partnership dissolution procedures that would protect my interests during the separation process. "The court hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning," Robert explained as I reviewed the documents. "Given the evidence of ongoing financial fraud, I'm confident we'll receive the injunctive relief we're requesting. Your husband will be legally prevented from making any changes to business structure or asset ownership without court approval." "How will he react when he's served with these papers?" "That depends on how clever he thinks he is versus how clever he actually is. Some people in his position recognize they've been caught and begin negotiating for the best possible outcome. Others double down on their deception and make their situation worse." I thought about David's personality, his tendency toward arrogance, and his assumption that he could manipulate any situation to his advantage. I suspect he'll choose the second option. "Then we'll be prepared for escalation. I've already arranged for additional security measures to protect both you and the business assets. Private investigators to monitor David's activities, security, upgrades for your home and office, and legal monitoring of all business accounts to prevent unauthorized transactions." The scope of Robert's preparations impressed me. This wasn't just legal representation, it was comprehensive warfare against someone who'd declared himself my enemy through his actions. For the first time since discovering David's betrayal, I felt like I had an ally whose strategic thinking matched the scope of the challenge we were facing. That evening, I returned home to find David pacing in our living room, his phone pressed to his ear in what appeared to be an intense conversation. He glanced up when I entered, his expression flickering between annoyance and something that might have been concern. "I need to call you back," he said into the phone, ending the conversation abruptly. "Sarah, we need to talk." "About what?" I asked, settling into the armchair across from where he'd resumed pacing. "I've been thinking about our anniversary party. Maybe we should scale it back, make it more intimate. Just close family and a few friends instead of the big celebration we planned." The suggestion was so transparently self-serving that I almost laughed. David wanted to reduce the audience for his planned announcement, probably because he'd realized that publicly humiliating me in front of our entire professional network might generate more backlash than he'd anticipated. "Why would we change our plans now?" I asked innocently. "We've already sent invitations, booked the venue, arranged catering. Everyone's expecting a celebration." David's pacing became more agitated. I just think smaller would be more meaningful. More personal. Less pressure, you know. Pressure about what? He stopped pacing and looked at me directly, his expression carefully composed. Sarah, I've been doing some thinking about our marriage, our partnership, our future together. I wonder if we've grown in different directions over the years. There it was, the opening gambit of his planned separation announcement, delivered weeks early in the privacy of our home instead of publicly at our anniversary party. David was testing my reaction, gauging whether I suspected anything about his plans. Different directions how? I asked, maintaining the same innocent tone. Professionally, we've developed different strengths and interests. You're more detail-oriented, focused on the operational aspects of the business. I'm more strategic, better with big-picture vision and client relationships. Maybe it's time we acknowledged those differences and structured our partnership accordingly. The euphemism for stealing my company was almost poetic in its deception. Are you suggesting we change our business arrangement? I asked. I'm suggesting we evolve. Adapt our roles to match our natural abilities. You could focus on the aspects of the business you're most passionate about, and I could take on more of the strategic leadership responsibilities. Strategic leadership responsibilities. Another beautiful euphemism for complete control, while reducing me to a subordinate role in my own company. That's an interesting perspective, I said thoughtfully. Have you discussed this idea with anyone else? Jennifer, perhaps, or any of our business advisors? David's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. I've done some preliminary research on restructuring options. Nothing formal, just exploring possibilities. And what did you discover? There are several ways we could modify our partnership structure to better reflect our different contributions and future goals. It's really a matter of determining what arrangement would be most beneficial for both of us. Most beneficial for both of us. The man who'd been systematically excluding me from business decisions, stealing credit for my work, and planning to announce our separation at our anniversary party, was now presenting theft as mutual benefit. I'd be interested in reviewing any specific proposals you've developed, I said. Partnership restructuring is a significant decision that would require careful consideration of all the legal and financial implications. David's confidence seemed to waver slightly. Of course, I wouldn't want to proceed with anything without your full understanding and agreement. Good. Then let's plan to discuss this more thoroughly after the anniversary party. I'd hate for business concerns to overshadow our celebration. The relief on David's face was unmistakable. He thought he'd successfully planted the seeds of his restructuring proposal without arousing suspicion. He believed I was still the trusting, naive wife who could be manipulated through careful presentation of his self-serving plans. That sounds perfect, he said, his natural charm returning. After the party, we'll sit down and explore all our options together. Together. The word carried such irony, considering that David had been planning my professional destruction without my knowledge or consent. But I smiled and nodded, playing the role of supportive wife while mentally preparing for the legal battle that would begin the next morning. The court hearing took place in a sterile conference room that felt more like a corporate boardroom than a traditional courtroom. Robert had explained that emergency injunctive relief requests were often handled in chambers rather than open court, particularly when they involved complex business matters and sensitive financial information. Judge Patricia Hernandez reviewed our filing with the methodical thoroughness I'd hoped for. She examined the financial documents Jennifer had provided, the evidence of fraudulent expense reports, and the documentation of David's attempts to restructure our partnership without proper authorization. Mr. Chen, the judge said, addressing Robert directly, your client is alleging systematic financial fraud and attempted theft of business assets by her husband and business partner. These are serious accusations that would normally require extensive investigation before any injunctive relief could be granted. Your Honor, Robert replied smoothly, the evidence we've presented demonstrates ongoing financial irregularities and immediate risk of asset manipulation. My client's husband has scheduled meetings to execute business restructuring documents as early as this week, without her knowledge or consent. We're requesting emergency intervention to prevent irreversible damage to her legal and financial interests. Judge Hernandez turned to the stack of financial documents spread across her desk. The expense reports and vendor payments you've highlighted do appear suspicious. The proposed partnership restructuring documents suggest deliberate attempt to modify business ownership without proper legal process. She reviewed several more pages before looking up. I'm granting limited injunctive relief. All changes to business ownership structure, asset transfers, and banking authorities are suspended pending proper legal review and consent from both partners. Both parties are enjoined from making any modifications to business operations or financial arrangements without court approval. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. David's planned theft of my company had been legally prevented, at least temporarily. He could no longer execute his restructuring scheme without my consent and court oversight. Additionally, Judge Hernandez continued, I'm ordering immediate forensic accounting review of all business financial records for the past 12 months. If the irregularities alleged in this filing are confirmed, there may be grounds for additional legal action. Robert and I left the courthouse with copies of the signed court orders, which would be served on David within hours. The legal protection I'd secured was comprehensive, but it also meant that the covert phase of our confrontation was ending. David would soon realize that his carefully planned betrayal had been discovered and countered. How do you think he'll react? I asked Robert as we walked to our cars. Badly, Robert replied with grim satisfaction. Men like your husband don't handle being outmaneuvered gracefully. He's been operating under the assumption that he held all the advantages, that you were too trusting and passive to fight back effectively. Learning that you've been building a legal case against him while he thought he was manipulating you will be a significant psychological shock. That afternoon, I worked from my home office, monitoring my phone and email for any reaction from David. The court orders would be served at our business office, where David was supposedly meeting with potential clients. In reality, he was probably planning his next moves with Amanda, unaware that their schemes had been legally neutralized. The call came at 3:30. David's voice was tight with controlled anger when I answered. Sarah, we need to talk immediately. I'm coming home. Is everything all right? I asked, maintaining the innocent concern that had served me well throughout this process. Just be there when I arrive, he said, ending the call abruptly. 20 minutes later, David burst through our front door with an expression I'd never seen before. Gone was the charming confidence, the patient condescension, the calculated manipulation. In its place was raw fury barely contained by his awareness that he was trapped in circumstances beyond his control. What the hell is this? He demanded, waving the court documents in my face. I glanced at the papers as if seeing them for the first time. Those appear to be legal documents. Where did you get them? They were served on me at the office an hour ago. Injunctive relief, preventing business restructuring, forensic accounting review, allegations of financial fraud. His voice rose with each phrase. What games are you playing, Sarah? I'm not playing any games, I replied calmly. But I am protecting my legal interests in our business partnership. Your legal interests? What about my legal interests? What about the fact that we're supposed to be partners in this marriage and this business? The hypocrisy was staggering. David was outraged that I'd taken legal action to prevent him from stealing my company, while he'd been systematically planning to defraud me for months. You're absolutely right, I said, my voice remaining steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. We are supposed to be partners. In our marriage and our business, equal partners, with equal rights and equal respect for each other's contributions. David's anger faltered slightly, perhaps recognizing the dangerous ground he was walking on. But partnership requires honesty, I continued. It requires transparency and mutual respect. It requires not using company funds to finance personal relationships with employees. The color drained from David's face. What are you talking about? I'm talking about $37,000 in fraudulent expense reports submitted by Amanda Torres and approved by you. I'm talking about business meals that were personal dates, hotel accommodations for romantic getaways, and consulting fees for work that was already covered by salary. David sank into the nearest chair, the fight leaving his body as he realized the scope of what I'd discovered. Sarah, I can explain. I'm sure you can. You've become quite skilled at explanations over the past few months. The fake conferences, the imaginary client meetings, the strategic planning sessions that somehow never included the other founding partner. You don't understand the pressure I've been under, the responsibility of being the public face of the company, the expectations from clients and investors, the pressure of being credited with work you didn't do, the responsibility of stealing ideas from your own wife and presenting them as your own innovations. David's composure cracked completely. That's not what happened. We're a team. Everything. We've built together. Then why were you planning to convert our partnership into a sole proprietorship without my knowledge? Why were you preparing to reduce my ownership stake while increasing your control over company assets? The silence stretched between us as David realized that his carefully constructed deceptions had been systematically dismantled. His perfect plan had become perfect evidence of his own criminal behavior. What do you want? He asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I want justice, I replied. I want accountability for your actions. And I want you to understand that the woman you thought you could manipulate and discard has been several steps ahead of you all along. David looked up at me with something that might have been recognition. For the first time in months, he was seeing me clearly, not as the passive wife he'd taken for granted, but as the strategic mind that had built our business success. The anniversary party is still happening, I continued. All our friends and colleagues are expecting to celebrate 15 years of marriage and partnership. I wouldn't want to disappoint them. The implications of my words hung in the air between us. David had planned to use our anniversary party as the stage for announcing our separation and his takeover of the company. Now, he would face that same audience while dealing with the consequences of his documented fraud and failed theft. Sarah, please. We can work this out. We can find a solution that works for both of us. We already have a solution, I said, standing to leave the room. It's called justice, and it's going to be served exactly as you planned. Publicly, dramatically, and with all the people who matter watching. David remained in his chair as I walked away, finally understanding that he'd underestimated not just my intelligence, but my capacity for strategic warfare. The anniversary party was 5 days away, and everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. My plan, not his. The morning of our anniversary party dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of Pacific Northwest sunshine that made Portland's skyline shimmer like a promise. I stood at our bedroom window, watching the city wake up below, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me. Today would be the culmination of weeks of careful planning, the moment when David's elaborate betrayal would collide with my equally elaborate preparation. David had barely spoken to me since our confrontation 3 days earlier. He moved through our house like a ghost, his usual confident swagger replaced by the cautious movements of someone who knew they were walking through a minefield. The court orders had effectively neutered his ability to steal our company, but he still believed he held some cards to play. He still thought today's anniversary celebration would provide him with an opportunity to control the narrative of our separation. He was wrong about that too. I'd spent the morning reviewing every detail of the plan Robert and I had crafted. The guest list had been carefully curated over the past month. ensuring that everyone who mattered in our professional and social circles would be present. Margaret Foster from our biggest client account, Elena Rodriguez, my former assistant, who'd provided crucial early warnings about David's schemes. Thomas Ward, a family friend who also happened to be a retired investigative journalist. Jennifer Kim, our accountant, who would serve as a witness to the financial irregularities she'd uncovered. Most importantly, Amanda Torres would be there. David had insisted on inviting her, claiming it would look suspicious if our marketing director wasn't present at such a significant company celebration. He didn't know that Amanda's presence was exactly what I'd been counting on. The Riverside Grand Hotel had transformed their main ballroom into an elegant celebration space. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over round tables draped in ivory, linens, each centerpiece featuring white roses and eucalyptus branches. A string quartet played softly in one corner, while bartenders prepared champagne cocktails at stations positioned around the room's perimeter. Everything was perfect, beautiful, and completely inappropriate for what was about to unfold. I arrived at the hotel 2 hours before the scheduled start time, ostensibly to oversee final preparations, but actually to coordinate with Robert and ensure all our contingencies were in place. He met me in a small conference room adjacent to the ballroom, carrying his usual leather briefcase and wearing an expression of focused intensity. "Everything is ready," he said without preamble. "The forensic accountant has completed her preliminary review and will be available to present findings if needed. The private investigator has documented David and Amanda's activities over the past month, including several instances of company resource misuse. The court-appointed business mediator is standing by to facilitate immediate asset protection measures." And the timing? "I'll arrive 30 minutes after David makes whatever announcement he's planning. That should give him enough time to commit fully to his narrative before we introduce contradictory evidence." Robert opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick manila envelope sealed with tamper-evident tape. Complete documentation of every fraudulent transaction, every manipulated business record, every instance of partnership agreement violation. If David wants to make this public, we'll make it comprehensive. I accepted the envelope with steady hands, feeling the weight of months of investigation and preparation. What about Amanda? She's been served with her own set of legal documents: demand for restitution of fraudulently obtained funds, termination of employment for cause, and potential criminal referral for theft of company resources. She'll receive those papers the moment David begins his announcement. The elegance of the timing was almost artistic. While David thought he was orchestrating my public humiliation, every aspect of his betrayal would be systematically exposed to the same audience he'd chosen to witness my supposed downfall. Guests began arriving at 6 o'clock, filling the ballroom with the comfortable buzz of conversation and laughter that characterized our social circle. I moved through the crowd with practiced grace, greeting friends and colleagues while internally monitoring David's behavior and location. He stood near the bar, holding court with several business associates, his charm turned up to maximum wattage as he played the role of successful entrepreneur celebrating his marriage. Amanda arrived fashionably late, wearing a stunning black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She made a beeline for David, positioning herself strategically within his circle of admirers while maintaining the appropriate professional distance that fooled exactly no one. Who was actually paying attention? I watched their interaction with clinical interest, noting the subtle touches, the meaningful glances, the coordinated timing of their movements around the room. They'd become careless about hiding their relationship, probably because they assumed I was too oblivious to notice or too passive to care. Margaret Foster approached me near the champagne fountain, her expression carrying the warmth of genuine friendship mixed with professional respect. "Sarah, this is a beautiful celebration. 15 years is quite an achievement in today's world." "Thank you, Margaret. David and I have been through quite a journey together." "I imagine you have. Building a successful business while maintaining a marriage requires tremendous partnership and mutual respect. The irony of her words was almost painful. Partnership and mutual respect are certainly essential elements. Margaret studied my face with the perceptive intelligence that had made her one of Portland's most successful CEOs. I hope you know how much I value your strategic insights and professional judgment. Your work on our rebranding campaign was exceptional, truly innovative thinking that exceeded our highest expectations. I appreciate that recognition, Margaret. Sometimes the most important contributions happen behind the scenes. Not in my experience, Margaret replied firmly. The best leaders ensure that excellence is recognized and credited appropriately, regardless of where it originates. Her words carried subtle weight, and I realized that Margaret had been observing the dynamics between David and me more closely than I'd recognized. She'd seen him claiming credit for my work, and she'd drawn her own conclusions about our professional relationship. Elena Rodriguez appeared at my elbow, looking elegant in a navy blue dress that complemented her professional demeanor. Sarah, congratulations on reaching this milestone. You and David have created something truly impressive with Mitchell & Associates. Thank you, Elena. Your support during your time with the company was invaluable. Elena's eyes flickered toward David, who was still entertaining his audience near the bar. I've always admired your grace under pressure and your ability to maintain focus on what really matters. Another coded message of support, delivered with the subtle precision that had made Elena such an effective assistant. She understood what was coming, and she was positioning herself as an ally for whatever consequences would follow. Thomas Ward joined our small group, carrying 2 champagne flutes and wearing the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who'd spent decades in newsrooms. Ladies, I hope you don't mind if I steal Sarah for a moment. I wanted to discuss some industry trends that might interest her. Thomas guided me toward a quieter corner of the ballroom, his expression shifting to something more serious once we were out of earshot from the main crowd. Sarah, I've been observing this evening with professional interest, he said quietly. There's an undercurrent here that suggests tonight might be more eventful than a typical anniversary celebration. What makes you think that? 25 years of covering business and politics teaches you to recognize when something significant is about to happen. The guest list, the timing, the carefully managed atmosphere, it all feels like a stage being set for drama. Thomas sipped his champagne thoughtfully. I also noticed that you're moving through this crowd like someone who knows exactly what's coming next, while your husband appears to be preparing for some kind of performance. His journalistic instincts were sharp enough to cut glass. If something newsworthy does happen tonight, I hope you'll remember that there are always multiple perspectives to every story. Always, Thomas agreed. And I've always found that the most interesting perspectives come from the people who've been underestimated. At 7:30, David moved to the small stage area where the string quartet had been performing. He requested their attention with the confident gestures of someone accustomed to commanding a room. The conversations gradually died as our guests turned toward the front of the ballroom. Thank you all for being here tonight, David began, his voice carrying easily across the space. Sarah and I are deeply touched by your presence as we celebrate 15 years of marriage and partnership. I stood near the back of the crowd, watching David's performance with detached fascination. He looked handsome and confident under the stage lights, every inch the successful entrepreneur celebrating his personal and professional achievements. 15 years ago, Sarah and I made a commitment to build a life together, David continued. We've shared incredible successes, weathered challenges, and created something meaningful both in our marriage and in our business. The irony was breathtaking. David was using our anniversary celebration to set up his announcement of our separation, presenting himself as a gracious husband, even as he prepared to publicly humiliate me. However, David said, his tone shifting slightly, sometimes growth requires change. Sometimes partnership evolves in directions that require new definitions of success and fulfillment. A murmur ran through the crowd as people began to sense that this wasn't going to be a typical anniversary toast. I caught Margaret Foster's eye from across the room, noting her expression of growing concern. Sarah and I have realized that we've grown in different directions over the years, David continued, his voice gaining confidence as he committed to his narrative. Professionally, we've developed different visions for Mitchell and Associates. Personally, we've discovered that our goals for the future don't align as closely as they once did. The crowd had gone completely silent, the kind of uncomfortable quiet that settles over a room when people realize they're witnessing something they'd rather not see. Therefore, David said, pausing for dramatic effect, Sarah and I have decided to separate. We'll remain committed to the success of Mitchell and Associates, but under new leadership structure that better reflects our individual strengths and aspirations. The silence stretched for several seconds before uncomfortable murmurs began rippling through the ballroom. David smiled with practiced grace, as if he'd just announced a new business venture rather than the dissolution of his marriage. I want to thank you all for your support during this transition, he continued. Sarah and I both value your friendship and look forward to maintaining our professional relationships as we move forward separately. From my position near the back of the room, I could see the shocked faces of our guests, the uncomfortable shifting as people tried to process what they'd just witnessed. This wasn't how anniversary celebrations were supposed to end, and David's smooth delivery couldn't disguise the calculated cruelty of his timing and venue choice. That's when Robert Chen walked through the ballroom doors. He moved with purpose, his dark suit and professional bearing cutting through the crowd like a knife. Behind him walked a woman I recognized as the forensic accountant he'd mentioned, carrying a briefcase and wearing the neutral expression of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome financial news. David's confident smile faltered as he noticed the newcomers approaching the front of the room. His eyes found mine across the crowd, and I saw the first flash of uncertainty in his expression. Mr. David Mitchell, Robert said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. I represent Sarah Mitchell in legal matters related to your business partnership and marriage. The crowd turned to watch this unexpected development, sensing that the evening's drama was far from over. David remained on the small stage, his composure beginning to crack as he realized that his carefully planned announcement had been hijacked by forces beyond his control. I have legal documents that require your immediate attention, Robert continued, withdrawing papers from his briefcase. These concern allegations of financial fraud, partnership agreement violations, and misappropriation of business assets. David's face went white. This is neither the time nor the place for business discussions. On the contrary, Robert replied smoothly. You've chosen to make your personal and professional relationship with my client a matter of public record. These documents are therefore entirely relevant to the announcements you've just made. Robert turned to address the crowd directly, his voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to controlling courtroom proceedings. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for interrupting your celebration, but Mr. Mitchell's statements require immediate clarification. He opened his briefcase and withdrew the manila envelope I'd seen earlier. Over the past 8 months, Mr. Mitchell and his employee Amanda Torres have engaged in systematic fraud against Mitchell and Associates, using company funds for personal expenses related to their extramarital affair. The collective gasp from the crowd was audible. David stepped backward on the stage, his confident demeanor completely shattered. The forensic accounting review ordered by the court has uncovered $37,000 in fraudulent expense reports, falsified vendor payments, and misappropriated company resources, Robert continued relentlessly. Mr. Mitchell has also attempted to steal his wife's ownership stake in the business through manipulated partnership documents and unauthorized restructuring procedures. Amanda Torres, who had been standing near the bar, began moving towards the exit, but her path was blocked by the forensic accountant, who stepped forward with her own set of documents. "Ms. Torres," the accountant said professionally, "you're required to accept service of these legal papers concerning restitution demands and employment termination for cause." The ballroom had erupted into shocked conversations as our guests processed what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a marriage ending, it was a business partnership dissolving due to criminal behavior. Robert raised his voice to regain control of the room. "Mrs. Sarah Mitchell remains the rightful co-owner of Mitchell & Associates and will be assuming full operational control pending resolution of the fraud investigation." That was my cue. I moved through the crowd toward the front of the room, my steps steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. When I reached the stage area, I looked directly at David, who stood frozen in place like a deer caught in headlights. "You wanted to make this public," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "You wanted to announce our separation in front of everyone who matters to us professionally and personally." David opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. "What you didn't anticipate," I continued, "was that I've been documenting your betrayal for weeks. Your affair with Amanda, your theft of company funds, your attempts to steal my ownership stake in the business we built together." I turned to address our guests directly, my voice remaining calm and professional despite the circumstances. "I apologize that you've been witnesses to this unpleasant revelation, but I want you to understand that David's announcement tonight was planned as a public humiliation designed to destroy my reputation while he claimed credit for our mutual success." Margaret Foster stepped forward from the crowd, her expression fierce with protective anger. "Sarah, if there's anything you need from a professional standpoint, you have my complete support." Thomas Ward had moved closer to the stage, his journalistic instincts engaged as he recognized the scope of the story unfolding before him. Elena Rodriguez stood beside him, her face showing the satisfaction of someone whose suspicions had been vindicated. David finally found his voice, though it came out as a hoarse whisper. "Sarah, this doesn't have to be public. We can resolve this privately." "You made it public when you chose our anniversary party as the venue for your announcement," I replied. "You made it public when you decided to steal from our company and humiliate me in front of our friends and colleagues." Robert stepped forward again, his professional demeanor unchanged by the emotional intensity of the confrontation. "Mr. Mitchell, you have 48 hours to respond to the legal documents you've been served. Failure to respond will result in default judgments for fraud, partnership dissolution, and criminal referral." The silence in the ballroom was deafening. David looked around at the faces of people who had respected him, trusted him, considered him a friend and business leader. Now, they saw him for what he really was, a man who had betrayed his wife, stolen from his own company, and planned to destroy the woman who had helped him build his success. Amanda Torres had finally made it to the exit, clutching the legal papers she'd been served while trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. Her departure marked the end of the romantic relationship that had cost David everything he'd built over 15 years. "The party's over," I announced to the crowd, my voice carrying a finality that left no room for interpretation. "Thank you all for coming, and thank you for witnessing the truth." As our guests began filing out of the ballroom, many of them stopped to offer their support, their business cards, their assurances that they understood who the real victim was in this situation. David remained on the stage, isolated and abandoned, finally comprehending the scope of his miscalculation. He had planned to destroy me publicly, to steal my company and replace me with his mistress while I stood helpless and humiliated. Instead, he had orchestrated his own professional suicide, exposing himself as a fraud and a thief in front of everyone whose opinion mattered. The anniversary party was over, but my new life was just beginning. The weeks following our anniversary party unfolded with the methodical precision of dominoes falling in a carefully arranged sequence. David's public exposure had created ripple effects throughout Portland's business community. and I found myself navigating a landscape where my professional reputation was being rebuilt while his crumbled in spectacular fashion. The morning after, the party. I arrived at Mitchell & Associates to find a cluster of reporters waiting outside our building. Thomas Ward had apparently decided that David's downfall constituted legitimate business news, and his connections in local media had amplified the story beyond our immediate social circle. I walked past the cameras without comment, but their presence served as a stark reminder that David's attempt to humiliate me had backfired into citywide scrutiny of his own behavior. Inside our offices, the atmosphere was electric with tension and anticipation. Staff members who had witnessed David's gradual marginalization of me over the past year were now seeing the full scope of what had been happening behind closed doors. Elena Rodriguez had returned to help manage the transition, and her presence provided both practical support and symbolic validation of my leadership legitimacy. "The phone hasn't stopped ringing," Elena reported, as I settled into what had been David's office the day before. Clients wanting to confirm that their accounts will be managed without disruption, competitors hoping to poach our talent during the chaos, and reporters looking for additional details about the fraud allegations. "What about David?" "He hasn't been in the office since yesterday. His assistant says he's working from home, but honestly, I think he's hiding from the consequences of what happened at the party." The cowardice was predictable, but still disappointing. David had spent months orchestrating elaborate schemes to steal my company and destroy my reputation, but when his plans collapsed, he couldn't even face the aftermath with dignity. Robert Chen arrived mid-morning with updates on the legal proceedings. That would determine our professional futures. The forensic accounting investigation had expanded beyond the initial $37,000 in fraudulent expenses, uncovering additional irregularities that painted an even more damaging picture of David's financial misconduct. The court-appointed auditor discovered systematic manipulation of client billing, unauthorized use of company credit accounts, and falsification of expense reports dating back almost 2 years, Robert explained, spreading documents across the conference table. The total financial impact exceeds $80,000, not including the potential damage to client relationships and company reputation. What are the criminal implications? The district attorney's office has opened a formal investigation based on our complaint and the forensic evidence. David and Amanda Torres are both facing potential charges for theft, fraud, and conspiracy to commit business crimes. The scope of their criminal exposure was staggering, but it also created opportunities for resolution that didn't require prolonged litigation. Are they likely to accept plea bargains to avoid trial? Almost certainly. Neither of them wants. Their crimes aired in open court, and the evidence against them is overwhelming. We should expect settlement negotiations within the next few weeks. Robert opened another folder containing documents I recognized as partnership dissolution agreements. More immediately, we need to formalize the business restructuring that protects your interests and removes David from operational control. The legal mechanics were complex, but the outcome was straightforward. David would retain minority ownership stake in Mitchell & Associates, but surrender all management authority and operational involvement. His fraudulent activities had voided his claim to equal partnership, and the court-imposed restrictions prevented him from interfering with business operations. What about Amanda Torres? Terminated for cause, effective immediately. She's also liable for restitution of all fraudulently obtained funds, and her potential criminal charges make her unemployable in any position requiring financial responsibility. The swift justice was satisfying, but it also created practical challenges for running the company. Amanda had been managing several significant client accounts, and her sudden departure required immediate reorganization of our operational structure. Margaret Foster provided the solution to that challenge when she called that afternoon with an unexpected proposal. "Sarah, I've been thinking about yesterday's revelations and their implications for your business operations. I assume you're dealing with significant staffing disruptions?" That's an understatement. We've lost our marketing director and effectively our CEO in the same day. I have a proposition that might benefit both of us. My company has been considering expanding our internal marketing capabilities, but we've been hesitant to build that infrastructure from scratch. What if we formed a strategic partnership that provides you with immediate revenue stability while giving us access to your expertise? The offer was more generous than I dared hope. Margaret was proposing a long-term consulting contract that would replace the revenue lost from David's mismanagement, while providing her company with services they needed. I'm interested, but I want to be transparent about our current situation. We're dealing with significant internal reorganization and potential legal complications, which is exactly why you need partners who understand your value and are willing to invest in your success, Margaret replied firmly. Your strategic insights haven't changed because your husband turned out to be a criminal. If anything, your handling of this crisis demonstrates exactly the kind of professional judgment we want to work with. Other clients followed Margaret's lead over the following days. Companies that had been working with Mitchell & Associates, because of my expertise, not David's salesmanship, reached out to confirm their continued relationship with the firm. Several new prospects emerged, apparently attracted by the media coverage that had highlighted my role in building the company's success. The most surprising validation came from industry colleagues who had observed David's behavior at conferences and networking events over the past year. Women executives in particular reached out to share their own experiences with his inappropriate conduct and professional boundary violations. Jessica Martinez, a marketing director at a competing firm, called to offer both personal support and professional collaboration. Sarah, I wanted you to know that David's behavior at the Digital Marketing Summit last spring made several of us uncomfortable. He was aggressively flirtatious with female attendees and dismissive of women's contributions during panel discussions. I had no idea his conduct extended beyond our personal and business relationship. That's because men like David are skilled at compartmentalizing their misconduct. They present one face to their wives and another to their professional colleagues. But people notice patterns of disrespect, and your husband had developed quite a reputation. Jessica's revelations explained some of the enthusiastic support I'd received from other business leaders. David's public exposure had validated concerns that many professionals had been harboring privately, and my emergence as the legitimate leader of Mitchell & Associates represented justice beyond just my personal situation. The financial resolution came faster than Robert had predicted. Within 3 weeks of the anniversary party, David's attorney contacted us with a settlement proposal that included full restitution of stolen funds, voluntary surrender of his management role in the company, and cooperation with ongoing criminal investigations. He's terrified of going to trial, Robert explained during our review of the settlement terms. The media attention has destroyed his reputation in Portland's business community, and criminal prosecution would make his situation exponentially worse. What about Amanda? Similar settlement, plus agreement to leave the state and not seek employment in marketing or advertising for 2 years. She's essentially accepting professional exile in exchange for avoiding criminal conviction. The terms were more favorable than I'd expected, reflecting David's desperation to minimize his legal exposure. He would retain 10% ownership stake in Mitchell & Associates, but surrender all operational control and decision-making authority. His financial obligations included not just restitution of stolen funds, but also payment of my legal fees and business restructuring costs. Most importantly, David would be legally prohibited from using the Mitchell & Associates name or claiming association with the company's work in any future professional endeavors. His attempt to steal my business would result in permanent professional banishment from the industry we'd built together. The divorce proceedings moved with similar efficiency. Oregon's no-fault divorce laws simplified the legal process, but David's documented fraud complicated the asset division in ways that favored my interests. Property acquired through stolen company funds became subject to restitution claims, and David's criminal conduct voided prenuptial provisions that might have protected his separate assets. Our Pearl District home, purchased primarily with funds I'd contributed from my trust account, would remain mine. David's luxury car, financed through fraudulent company expenses, would be sold to satisfy restitution obligations. His investment portfolio, built partially through stolen money, would be subject to forensic accounting to determine what portion represented legitimate versus criminal proceeds. The comprehensive nature of David's financial exposure meant that his divorce settlement would leave him with minimal assets and significant ongoing legal obligations. His attempt to destroy my life had instead destroyed his own financial security and professional future. 6 months after the anniversary party, I stood in the renovated offices of what was now simply Sarah Mitchell Strategic Marketing. The name change reflected both my sole ownership and my strategic focus on high-level consulting rather than broad-spectrum marketing services. The client base had stabilized around companies that valued strategic thinking over superficial charm, and our revenue had actually increased despite losing David's supposed sales expertise. Elena Rodriguez had become my chief operations officer, bringing organizational skills and institutional knowledge that made the transition seamless. We'd hired 2 additional strategic consultants, both women with impressive credentials who were attracted by our reputation for valuing actual expertise over political maneuvering. Margaret Foster remained our largest client, but our portfolio had expanded to include several technology companies, 2 healthcare organizations, and a sustainable energy firm that appreciated our data-driven approach to market analysis. The work was intellectually stimulating and financially rewarding in ways that our previous operations had never achieved. "Sarah, you have a visitor," Elena announced from my office doorway, her expression carrying a mixture of amusement and concern. David stood in our reception area, looking significantly older than the 6 months that had passed since our confrontation. His usual polished appearance had been replaced by something closer to desperation, and his confident bearing had been replaced by the posture of someone who'd learned what real consequences felt like. 5 minutes? I told Elena, gesturing for David to follow me into my office. He sat across from my desk without invitation, his eyes taking in the changes I'd made to the space. The heavy, masculine furniture he'd preferred had been replaced, with clean lines and natural materials. The walls displayed awards and recognitions for my strategic work, not our joint accomplishments. Everything about the environment reflected my individual identity rather than our former partnership. "The business looks successful," David said quietly. "It is successful. More successful than it's ever been." I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. "You were always the strategic mind behind our operations." The admission was too little and far too late, but it represented more honest self-reflection than David had demonstrated during our marriage. "What do you want, David?" I wanted to apologize. Not because my attorney recommended it, or because I'm hoping for legal consideration, but because I genuinely understand now how badly I treated you. I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculated charm. Instead, I saw something that might have been genuine remorse, though it was difficult to trust any emotion from someone who'd proven himself capable of elaborate deception. The therapy I've been required to attend as part of my settlement agreement has helped me recognize patterns of behavior I didn't want to acknowledge, David continued. My need to control everything, my inability to share credit, my assumption that I deserved more recognition than I'd actually earned. And the affair? David's expression tightened with what appeared to be shame. A symptom of the same problems. I convinced myself that I deserved someone who appreciated my supposed genius, someone who wouldn't challenge my inflated self-image the way you'd begun to do. Amanda appreciated your willingness to steal money for expensive restaurants and romantic getaways. That's not the same as appreciating your professional capabilities. I know that now. Amanda disappeared the moment she realized there would be consequences for our actions. She was attracted to the lifestyle I could provide, not to me as a person. The insight was accurate but irrelevant. David's recognition of his mistakes didn't undo the damage he'd caused or restore the years I'd spent building a business he'd tried to steal. "What are you doing now?" I asked. "Working as a sales associate for a small advertising firm in Seattle. Entry-level position, probationary employment, strict supervision of all client interactions. It's humbling, but it's honest work that doesn't require anyone to trust me with significant responsibility." The dramatic fall from CEO to entry-level employee would have seemed poetic if it weren't so predictable. David's skills had always been superficial, dependent on claiming credit for other people's work and manipulating situations to his advantage. Stripped of those advantages, he was discovering his actual market value. "I'm glad you found employment," I said neutrally. "Sarah, I know I have no right to ask for anything from you, but I want you to know that I understand what I lost through my own actions. Not just the business or the money, but the partnership, with someone whose intelligence and integrity made me better than I actually was." The words carried emotional weight that might have moved me 6 months earlier. Now they simply felt like another form of manipulation, an attempt to generate sympathy for consequences he'd brought upon himself. "I appreciate your apology, David, but understanding what you lost doesn't repair the damage you caused or restore what you destroyed. I know. I just wanted you to know that not everyone who betrays someone they love is incapable of recognizing their mistakes." David stood to leave, pausing at my office door for one final comment. "For what it's worth, watching you rebuild this company and seeing your success in the business press has made me proud in a way I probably don't deserve to feel." After he left, I sat in my office processing the unexpected encounter. David's apology had seemed genuine, and his acknowledgement of his mistakes appeared to reflect actual self-awareness rather than strategic positioning, but the emotional impact was surprisingly minimal. The man who had once been the center of my personal and professional world had become irrelevant to my current reality. That evening, I attended the annual Portland Business Excellence Awards, where Sarah Mitchell's strategic marketing had been nominated for innovation in strategic consulting. The recognition represented validation from the professional community that had witnessed both my marriage's destruction and my business's resurrection. Margaret Foster presented the award, her introduction highlighting not just my strategic capabilities, but also my resilience in the face of personal and professional challenges. "Sarah Mitchell represents the best of Portland's business community," she told the audience. "Strategic brilliance, ethical leadership, and the courage to fight for what she's built." As I accepted the award, I looked out at an audience filled with colleagues, clients, and competitors who had watched my transformation from marginalized wife to independent entrepreneur. The recognition felt earned in ways that joint accomplishments with David never had. This award belongs not just to me, but to everyone who believes that talent should be recognized regardless of gender, that partnerships should be based on mutual respect, and that justice is possible even when it requires fighting powerful people who think they're untouchable. The standing ovation lasted longer than was customary for business awards, reflecting appreciation not just for my professional achievements, but for the broader message my success represented. Later that evening, I returned to my Pearl District home, which had been transformed from a couple's residence into a reflection of my individual tastes and priorities. The masculine touches that had dominated our shared space were gone, replaced by art I'd chosen, furniture I preferred, and an overall aesthetic that reflected my personality rather than compromise. I poured myself a glass of wine and stepped onto the balcony overlooking Portland's skyline, the city lights spreading out like scattered diamonds against the dark sky. The view was the same one I'd shared with David for years, but everything else had changed in ways I couldn't have imagined when I first discovered his betrayal. My phone buzzed with a text message from Elena. "Saw the news coverage of your award. Congratulations, boss. You've built something incredible. Other messages followed from clients, colleagues, and friends who had supported me through the dissolution of my marriage and the rebuilding of my professional life. The network of relationships I'd cultivated over 15 years hadn't been lost when David tried to steal them along with everything else. Instead, those relationships had become stronger, based on direct interaction rather than filtered through his interpretation of my contributions. The financial statements Elena had prepared for our quarterly review showed revenues that exceeded our targets by 18%. Client satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs. Employee retention was 100%, a stark contrast to the turnover we'd experienced during David's final months of leadership. Most significantly, Sarah Mitchell Strategic Marketing had been approached by 3 companies interested in acquisition or strategic partnership. My individual reputation had generated more valuable opportunities than our joint venture had ever achieved. I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, making coffee for men who dismissed my contributions while planning strategies to steal the business I'd helped build. That version of myself seemed like a stranger now, someone whose potential had been constrained by loyalty to people who didn't deserve it. The transformation hadn't been easy or painless. Discovering David's betrayal had shattered assumptions about trust, partnership, and the security of relationships I'd taken for granted. But the destruction of those illusions had also freed me to build something authentic, something that reflected my actual capabilities rather than compromised versions of what I could achieve. Robert Chen had become not just my attorney but a trusted advisor whose strategic thinking complemented my business insights. Our professional relationship had evolved into genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared appreciation for precise, effective problem-solving. "You've created something remarkable," he'd told me during our last quarterly business review. "Not just the financial success, but the integrity of how you've built it. Your clients trust you because you've proven that your word means something, that your strategic recommendations are based on data rather than ego." The contrast with David's approach was stark. His version of business development had been built on charm, manipulation, and claiming credit for other people's work. My approach emphasized competence, transparency, and delivering results that exceeded expectations. The market had clearly indicated which philosophy generated sustainable success. 6 months later, I received an unexpected invitation to speak at the Women's Business Leadership Conference in San Francisco. The event organizers wanted me to address the topic of rebuilding after professional betrayal, sharing insights that might help other women navigate similar challenges. The speaking engagement represented recognition beyond Portland's business community, validation that my story had resonated with professional women who faced their own challenges with marginalization, credit theft, and systematic undermining by male colleagues. My presentation focused not on victimization or revenge, but on strategic thinking and systematic preparation for reclaiming professional identity. The audience was engaged and responsive, asking questions that demonstrated how common my experiences had been among women in competitive industries. "The most important lesson I learned," I told the audience during the question and answer session, "is that being underestimated can become a strategic advantage if you're patient and methodical." About documentation and alliance building. People who assume you're passive and naive will make mistakes that create opportunities for those who are actually paying attention. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with several attendees approaching me afterward to share their own stories of professional marginalization and recovery. Their experiences reinforced my understanding that David's behavior hadn't been uniquely terrible, but rather representative of patterns that many women encountered in male-dominated industries. 1 year after the anniversary party that had been intended as my public humiliation, I hosted my own celebration at the same hotel. The guest list included clients, colleagues, and the extended network of professionals who had supported my transition to independent business ownership. Margaret Foster offered a toast that captured the transformation everyone had witnessed. Sarah Mitchell has demonstrated that authentic leadership isn't about claiming credit or manipulating situations to personal advantage. It's about delivering results, maintaining integrity, and building relationships based on mutual respect rather than power imbalances. The celebration felt like a genuine anniversary, marking not just the survival of my business, but its evolution into something stronger and more sustainable than the partnership it had replaced. The success hadn't come from destroying David's reputation, but from building my own on the foundation of competence and reliability that had always been my actual strength. Thomas Ward, who had covered the original story of David's downfall, published a follow-up article about my business success that focused on strategic leadership and ethical business practices, rather than the dramatic personal circumstances that had generated initial media attention. Sarah Mitchell's story illustrates the difference between sustainable business success and the illusion of success built on manipulation and theft, he wrote. Her company's growth over the past year demonstrates that competence and integrity create more lasting value than charm and credit stealing. The article generated additional business opportunities and speaking invitations, extending my influence beyond Portland's regional market into national conversations about women's leadership and business ethics. That evening, I stood again on my balcony overlooking the city, reflecting on a year that had transformed every aspect of my personal and professional identity. David's attempt to destroy me had instead revealed strengths I hadn't fully recognized, and opportunities I wouldn't have pursued while constrained by a partnership that diminished rather than enhanced my capabilities. The woman who had discovered her husband's betrayal through overheard conversations and stolen text messages was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own value and insisted that others recognize it as well. The business that had been built on shared credit and compromised vision had become a focused enterprise that delivered exceptional results through strategic thinking and operational excellence. Most importantly, I had learned that justice doesn't always require courtroom victories or criminal prosecutions. Sometimes justice is simply the opportunity to demonstrate your actual capabilities without interference from people who benefit from your diminishment. David had gotten exactly what he deserved, which was consequences proportional to his actions and exclusion from the success he'd tried to steal. I had gotten something even better, which was the chance to build something authentic that reflected my genuine capabilities rather than compromised versions of what I could achieve. The future stretched ahead with possibilities that hadn't existed when my identity was tied to partnership with someone who saw me as a resource to be exploited, rather than a colleague to be respected. The woman I'd become was stronger, smarter, and more dangerous than the one David had tried to destroy. And that transformation was the most satisfying revenge of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. David thought he was planning the perfect ambush, a public humiliation that would leave me powerless and isolated. Instead, he was walking into a trap of his own making, one baited with his own arrogance and seasoned with months of documented criminal behavior. "What exactly will happen at the party?" I asked. Robert smiled, the expression transforming his normally neutral features into something almost menacing. "Your husband will announce that your marriage is over and that he's taking control of Mitchell and Associates. Then I'll arrive with documents demonstrating that he's been committing fraud against his own business partnership, that his new girlfriend has been helping him steal company funds, and that both of them are facing serious legal consequences for their actions. And then you'll announce that you're not just divorcing your husband, you're prosecuting him. Mitchell and Associates will continue under your leadership, minus the criminal elements that have been draining its resources. Your husband's perfect plan becomes perfect justice." I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest, a feeling I was beginning to recognize as anticipation. David wanted to destroy me publicly, to humiliate me in front of everyone who mattered in our professional and social circles. He thought he could steal my life's work and replace me with his mistress while I stood there helpless and defeated. He was about to learn exactly how wrong he could be about the woman he'd married 15 years ago. The woman he thought he knew was gone, replaced by someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. Our anniversary party was 3 weeks away. 3 weeks to finalize our legal strategy, gather the last pieces of evidence, and prepare for the performance of my lifetime. 3 weeks until David discovered that his perfect victim had become his perfect nemesis. The game was escalating, and I intended to win decisively. The following Monday morning brought unexpected validation of my growing suspicions about David's network of deception. Jennifer Kim, our company accountant, requested a private meeting that confirmed my worst fears while simultaneously strengthening my legal position beyond what I dared hope. Jennifer arrived at my home office looking visibly uncomfortable, clutching a manila folder against her chest like armor. We'd worked together for 3 years, and I'd never seen her appear so professionally conflicted. She declined my offer of coffee and sat rigidly in the chair across from my desk. "Sarah, I need to discuss some financial irregularities I've discovered in the company accounts," she began without preamble. "I've been wrestling with whether to bring this to your attention, but my professional ethics won't allow me to remain silent." My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression neutral. "What kind of irregularities?" Jennifer opened her folder and withdrew a stack of financial documents. "Over the past 8 months, I've noticed unusual patterns in expense reimbursements and vendor payments. Initially, I assumed they were legitimate business expenses that hadn't been properly documented. But when I began investigating further, I discovered discrepancies that suggest deliberate manipulation." She spread several expense reports across my desk, each one flagged with yellow sticky notes. These reports were submitted by Amanda Torres and approved by David. Business meals at high-end restaurants with clients who don't appear in our customer database. Hotel accommodations for conferences that aren't listed in any industry calendar. Transportation expenses for trips that don't correspond to any client meetings or business development activities. I examined the documents carefully, recognizing some of the dates and locations. The expensive restaurant where David claimed to have taken a potential client was the same place I'd suggested for our anniversary dinner, which he'd dismissed as too costly. The hotel accommodations were for a luxury resort in wine country, charged to our business account on a weekend when David told me he was visiting his mother. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked. "Approximately $37,000 over 8 months, Jennifer replied. "But that's just the obvious discrepancies. I suspect there are additional irregularities in vendor payments and consulting fees that would require a full forensic audit to uncover." Jennifer withdrew another set of documents from her folder. "There's something else. David has been requesting changes to our business entity structure and financial reporting procedures. He's asked me to prepare documentation for converting our partnership into a sole proprietorship, with significant changes to how profits and assets would be distributed." "Did he mention why he wanted these changes?" "He claimed you were planning to reduce your involvement in the company and transition to a more limited role. He said you'd agreed to restructure your partnership status to reflect your decreased participation." Jennifer's expression was carefully neutral, but her eyes searched my face for confirmation. "When I asked about documenting your consent to these changes, he said you preferred to handle legal matters informally and that formal documentation wasn't necessary." The audacity was breathtaking. David had been manipulating our accountant into preparing fraudulent business restructuring while telling her I'd agreed to diminish my own ownership stake. He'd been setting up financial infrastructure to steal my company while using my supposed cooperation as justification. "Jennifer, I want to be absolutely clear about something," I said firmly. "I have never agreed to reduce my involvement in Mitchell and Associates. I have never consented to restructuring our partnership agreement. David has been lying to you about my intentions and my knowledge of these proposed changes." Relief flooded Jennifer's features. I hoped that was the case. The proposed changes didn't align with what I observed about your actual involvement in company operations. You're still managing major client relationships and developing strategic initiatives. The suggestion that you were stepping back contradicted everything I could see. What made you decide to bring this to me directly? Jennifer hesitated before answering. Several things. The expense irregularities were troubling from a professional standpoint, but what really concerned me was David's insistence on keeping these financial changes confidential. He specifically instructed me not to discuss the restructuring plans with you, claiming it was meant to be a surprise related to your anniversary. A surprise related to our anniversary. David had been preparing to steal my company as an anniversary gift to himself, using our accountant as an unwitting accomplice in his fraud. I've prepared copies of all relevant financial documents, Jennifer continued, withdrawing a flash drive from her folder. Bank statements, expense reports, vendor payments, tax filings, partnership agreements, and the proposed restructuring documents David requested. Everything is organized chronologically and cross-referenced for easy analysis. I accepted the flash drive with genuine gratitude. Jennifer, I can't tell you how much I appreciate your professional integrity. This information is crucial for protecting both my interests and the company's financial health. There's one more thing, she said quietly.